All right. So, welcome to another episode of the Grateful Giraffe Cast. Today, we'll be talking with Elle Michel about how therapy can be used to heal trauma and PTSD. Welcome, Elle.
Hi, thanks, Max. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We are excited to have you here as well. Yeah, let's just jump right in. Can you share a little bit about your journey and how you ended up focusing on these really timely, important topics for all of us?
Yes, so I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I have a private practice where I specialize in treating trauma as well as borderline personality disorder, which is caused by trauma, and some people see as a kind of form of trauma. And I came to this field because I had my own therapy in my early 20s that was very transformational to me. I've had my own trauma in my life, and I've done a lot of work on that in my own therapy. And I had an experience therapeutically that was pretty profound and really life changing. And I just realized, like, this is an amazing tool that we have, and I want to be able to utilize this and use this to help other people. So after college, I went back to grad school for psychology and started down on this journey. And I really believe that to be an effective therapist, you have to, or I mean, I guess healer really of any type, you have to have kind of confronted and worked through some of your own stuff, right? So I kind of use my journey that I've been on healing myself. I kind of bring that with me into the room with my clients, not explicitly or directly. Like, I don't tell my clients, oh, when I went through this or whatever, right? But it's like energetically, I'm bringing that sense of, like, you can overcome things, you can heal from certain things, and I'm bringing that energy to my sessions.
Cool. Now, maybe we could start with some definitions. What exactly is trauma? What exactly is PTSD? Let's go a little bit deeper on those
Yeah.
two
So
concepts.
I distinguish trauma and stress from trauma from PTSD because in the world of psychology today, we have actually a very narrow definition of PTSD. And in order to qualify as having PTSD, you have to meet a whole bunch of different diagnostic criteria that many people who've been through a traumatic event and have stress related to that traumatic event don't meet the criteria for PTSD. There's been a big push in the field to expand the criteria for traumatic stress so that it encompasses more people's experience. But when we think about trauma, we kind of distinguish it from other forms of suffering or other forms of emotional distress in that it has to do with going through some type of event that is overwhelming to the nervous system and overwhelming to the brain when the event happens. So, one thing that's interesting about trauma is two people can go through the same event that, we could say, oh, that's a traumatic event, but one person could develop traumatic stress from that event and the other person might not. And it just depends on how their body and how their brain processed the information when the event happened. So the idea is that you go through something that's scary, that's intense, it's overwhelming to your nervous system, and you can't process it emotionally, and your brain can't store it as memory in the ideal way, in the correct way. So what happens when we develop traumatic stress is the brain stores the event as memory in such a way that if something reminds us of it, it's very activating, right? Like if I'm attacked by a bear and I develop traumatic stress from that, anything that reminds me of a bear is going to um, elicit like a huge nervous system response from me where my body is going to say, I'm in danger. I need to mobilize like a flight response or a fight response from anything that reminds me of that traumatic incident. we used to think that in order for something to be traumatic, it had to be life-threatening. And in fact, the definition of trauma that's in the DSM, that is the manual that we use for diagnosing mental illnesses, that still is there. Like, it has to be life-threatening or very, very close to life-threatening for it to like kind of count as trauma. But in the field among trauma specialists, we kind of discount that, right? So the idea is that something can be very, very impactful and very upsetting, even if it's not life-threatening, like, for example, say bullying or emotional neglect from a parent prolonged over a long period of time, where it's not like somebody was necessarily deprived of food and water, but their body still registered it as being really intense and overwhelming.
So how is trauma different than other forms of pain or discomfort, like depression or anxiety? How do you differentiate?
Yeah, so it's interesting to get into that. We kind of have to get into the different parts of the brain, right? So we have in our forehead, we have the cognitive part of the brain, which is like language and reason and logic. And then between our ears, we have the emotional and memory part of the brain. And then back above our neck, we have the reptilian brain, which is like our, breathing, digestion, that kind of thing. So when it comes to any basic emotion or any basic distress, anxiety, depression, OCD, things like that, normally what's going on, some emotional stuff, but a lot of cognitive stuff. And we might treat those issues by using the cognitive part of the brain. So by saying, like, somebody is depressed and they have a belief that says, I'm worthless, or my life is meaningless. And then we might challenge that belief on a conscious level and say, well, let's look for all the reasons why your life isn't meaningless, right? And so that's a very cognitive approach. When it comes to trauma, that cognitive approach isn't going to be as useful or as successful. So with trauma, the issue is happening in the limbic brain, the emotional part of the brain that's between our ears, and it's kind of focused there, and also in the reptilian brain that controls our nervous system and our digestion and all of that. So in order to adequately treat trauma, we have to use what we call a somatic approach, meaning a body-focused approach. So we're addressing the nervous system, we're addressing the unconscious, we're addressing the emotional center of the brain in a way that we might not need to address for somebody who's just a little depressed or a little anxious. A cognitive approach might work well for them. And the most common cognitive approach that some of you might be familiar with is called CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy, right? And cognitive behavior therapy says, oh, you have a belief that, your life is meaningless. Let's challenge that. Let's find ways to add meaning to your life. Let's change your behavior so that you feel better. And that approach can be very successful for a lot of people. But if there's a trauma root to what's going on, that approach isn't as likely to be successful. And that's when we need to bring in a trauma modality like EMDR, Brainspotting, somatic experiencing. And these are just some other modalities that encompass kind of more of the unconscious, the emotional part of the brain, and the nervous system.
So yeah, maybe we could just unpack some of those different treatments. And
Yeah.
what about, just the connection between most of our depression, most of our anxiety? Like, do you really think it's just a cognitive thing, or is everyone suffering from those conditions because of trauma? Like, how would you break down the number
Yeah.
of people who don't have trauma and are depressed versus do have trauma? That's just something that I'm
No, it's
curious
such
to
a good
hear.
question. And the more we learn about trauma, the more we're seeing more and more things being caused by trauma, right? So what the explanation that I just gave is a little bit more black and white. I think many people have a form of depression or a form of anxiety that is based in trauma at its core, and a cognitive approach could be helpful, but might not solve the whole problem and do the trick, right? So I'm a big advocate for using trauma modalities liberally, right? Like using them in most cases. But I have worked with plenty of people who their depression and their anxiety wasn't too deeply trauma rooted, right? Like it wasn't too somatically rooted in their body, and they were able to feel a lot better just from kind of changing their thoughts and changing their behavior. So I think it's like a spectrum, right? Like I think that you might have one person over here and one person over here and a lot of people in the middle.
Yeah, so let's unpack, what is EMDR, what is the brain spotting, what is somatic, what is not.
So all of these modalities are under the umbrella of somatic techniques or somatic psychotherapies, meaning they involve the brain and the body in a way that traditional talk psychotherapy doesn't. So EMDR is, I think, one of the most powerful modalities, and I'm trained in EMDR. So EMDR uses what's called bilateral stimulation to change the way that memories and emotions are stored and processed in the brain. So bilateral stimulation just means stimulating the left and right side of the body back and forth. So I can have the client tap like this, or we can use eye movements and have the client's eyes move from left to right. We can also use music that goes from left to right in the ears. So any form of stimulating the body left and right, back and forth, is considered bilateral stimulation. And what we do is we bring in bilateral stimulation, and then we talk about the traumatic event or the traumatic memory, and then we kind of process a little bit like the free association that we might see in like psychoanalytic work. And we just kind of follow the brain and let the brain kind of figure out what needs to happen or what needs to be discussed or processed in order to change the way that memories are stored in the brain. And what's happening is we're unpairing a traumatic like a stimulus from a response. So I like to give the example of someone who's been in war and they've seen combat, and they have a paired stimulus and response of a loud noise like a firecracker is to them, their body's interpreting that as a bomb, and it's life threatening, right? So they might come to the US on the 4th of July and hear the firecrackers, and on a conscious level they know this is a holiday, this is not a war, I'm not in danger, right? But on an unconscious level, on the emotional side of the brain, their brain cannot make that distinction, and their brain is hearing the noise and then mobilizing a huge threat response that says, when I hear this noise, my life is in danger, and I'm going to start shaking and trembling and sweating and all of that. So you can tell that person till you're blue in the face, hey, it's just a firecracker, this is safe. But that's a cognitive approach that's ignoring all of this other brain activity. So when we do EMDR, we're utilizing with the bilateral stimulation those deeper parts of the brain, and we're helping unpair the noise of the firecracker from the response of the threat. It's really powerful. And despite, I mean, EMDR is very heavily and well researched and proven to be effective, but we actually don't know exactly why the bilateral stimulation does that, right? And there's one theory that says when we're sleeping and we're in REM sleep, our eyes are moving around in our skull quite a bit. And there's some idea that the bilateral stimulation of EMDR replicates the eye movements in REM sleep. The idea being that when we sleep, when we get really good restful REM sleep, we wake up feeling better and our emotions are processed. So there's some idea that we're kind of capitalizing on that and utilizing that. The other piece of it that I love is that in most ancient societies, like hunter-gatherer tribal societies, when there would be wars or deaths or different things, there would be a lot of dancing and drumming and communal kind of processing of traumatic events, and all of that dancing and drumming is bilateral stimulation, right? So there's this idea that as ancient humans, we might have kind of understood this, and EMDR is just kind of a modern way of capitalizing on that.
Wow, fascinating. So
Yeah.
we should do more drum circles, basically.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, even like walking, right? If you are upset about something, you go on a walk, you're kind of looking around, scanning your environment. That's a little bilateral. And even the movement of your feet is a little bilateral. So bilateral stimulation can be used outside of EMDR just to help regulate emotions. And it's a fascinating modality. So that's EMDR. Brainspotting uses bilateral stimulation, and then it adds the position of the eyes in the brain as it correlates to where we hold traumatic memories in our brain. So you could say, I'm looking in this direction, or I'm looking in this direction, and that's going to correspond. So brain spotting is similar to EMDR, and then you have sensory motor psychotherapy and somatic experiencing, which use body sensations and nervous system responses to kind of help express whatever is stored of the trauma in the body to help like get them out of the body. I'm not trained in those modalities, so I'm a little bit less familiar with those. But I've worked with a lot of colleagues around, their training, and understood that those are also very powerful modalities.
And so what about you know, something like ketamine therapy? Is that something you recommend? Is that something that works? What do we need to know about the connection between trauma and, using ketamine to help us process trauma?
Yes, absolutely. So ketamine is one of the newer things that's being offered for trauma healing, and it's great for depression and anxiety also. But similar to how psychedelics impact the brain, what ketamine does is it causes a lot of new neural growth, right? So when you have, like the example I gave of the person who's been in combat, and then they have an association between the sound of the firework and or the bomb and the trauma response, the way that that's happening in the brain is through neurons that are connected. So when you do ketamine treatment, it just like floods the brain with new neurons so that those old neural connections don't feel as strong, and there's a lot of new neural growth. And the new neural growth can be in the area of, I am safe, this experience isn't life-threatening. It can just create a lot of new kind of synapses and new connections like that. So, I mean, when we do EMDR, when we do trauma therapy, what we're striving for is new neural synapses, new neural connections. So ketamine just kind of accelerates that process, and it can be very, very powerful. I've seen it have amazing results for trauma, for depression, even for trichotillomania, which is like the hair pulling disease, or whatever disease, illness, whatever condition. So yeah, and then I think, there's a lot of great research happening with psychedelics and, psilocybin and all kinds of different things that I think in the coming years, we're going to see even more of those types of modalities.
Cool. Now, when we're first born, we're coming out of the womb, is that not a trauma experience for each human that we hold with us? And is there a way to kind of correct for that fear that comes from, being in the warmth and being nurtured to suddenly being in this very uncomfortable situation where we're crying? Like, I've always just wondered how we heal from that almost original trauma. Is that something you have an opinion on?
It's such a good question. And certainly I guess I'm not of the opinion that every single birth is by definition traumatic, But certainly if there's, and by the way, I could be wrong about that, right? Like it's totally possible that just to go from the womb to the outside world is traumatic for everybody. But certainly when there's birth trauma, like when there's, a near-death experience or a health issue or the umbilical cord wrapped around the neck or different things, like certainly that can be lodged in the nervous system as trauma. And another thing that can be really challenging is when somebody is born and then they need to be in the NICU, and they're not able to get that like skin to skin contact and they're kind of hooked up to machines and stuff. That can create a lot of issues that we can then process. And one of the things that is interesting about trauma therapy, EMDR, Brainspotting, somatic, is that in order to process the traumatic event, you don't need to have a conscious memory of it, right? So if somebody does have birth trauma, they probably don't have a conscious memory of it, but they certainly can still work on that and address that.
Yeah. So how should we go about recognizing where we may have trauma in our lives, and how do we know where in the body the trauma is stored?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the some of the signs of trauma, and this is kind of the most simple one that I share with people, is like if you have some event that happens that should be irritating or upsetting on a 0 to 10 scale, like maybe it should be a 3 or a 4, but your reaction is like a 7 or an 8, that can be a sign that that particular event hit an old wound and is hitting like an old trauma, right? It can also be a sign that you're sleep deprived or you're really hungry, or so it's not necessarily like, oh, this is trauma. But if you find like a certain thing happening again and again, like I was working with a client the other day who experienced a rejection dating, and it wasn't somebody they were even really super into. Like it wasn't like they were like, oh, this is my soulmate, whatever. It was just somebody who arranged a date with them and then canceled, and they were experiencing that as like a huge loss and a huge rejection, and it was bringing up issues of self-worth. And for that person, we connected that back to a lot of childhood experiences from their parents around receiving messages of you're not worthy, you're not lovable. And so that can be a really good indication, right? If you have kind of a bigger reaction to something than is necessarily warranted by the situation. Another thing would be like if you tend to avoid certain stimuli, certain topics, certain places, because they bring up a negative reaction and you just can't handle it. That can definitely be an indication that there's a little bit of trauma there. Another thing is if, you're easily triggered by something that maybe you try to avoid, but you can't avoid. And then when it happens, you experience not only an emotional reaction, but a physical reaction, right? Like heart racing, stomach clenching, muscle tightening. That's an indication that there really is an association paired in your brain with this event equals something life-threatening, and that often is a sign of trauma. And I'm seeing some activity in the chat. Should I be looking at the chat?
We're gonna move to the chat
Oh,
in just a few minutes.
oh,
So
okay. Just want to make sure I'm not missing
perfect. Yeah, and feel free to keep them coming, to create the queue. We'll get there just in a few minutes. How do you think people should cope in real time, when sort of this trauma response emerges? What are some, good ways
that.
to identify that it's happening, and then, maybe not become completely flooded as a
Yeah,
result?
such a good question. So one of the modalities I didn't mention was dialectical behavior therapy, which is DBT. And DBT can be really useful for treating the symptoms of trauma, which could be like flashbacks, high levels of distress. DBT isn't as good for treating the root cause of trauma, and that's where we need to go to EMDR, Brainspotting, somatic, that kind of thing. But one of the DBT skills that I love for treating trauma is called the TIP skill, and it's an acronym that stands for temperature, intense exercise, and paced breathing and paired muscle relaxation. So there's a nerve going from our brain down through our neck, chest, and into our digestive system called the vagus nerve. And when the vagus nerve gets activated, it triggers us to feel calm and safe and peaceful. So one of the ways we can activate the vagus nerve is through cold temperatures to the face. So that's where I instruct my clients and even friends, and I do it all the time if I'm upset, to put an ice pack to the face, like over the eyes, even on the neck or the chest, to take a cold shower. I think certainly doing an ice dive can help, if you have that available to you. But so that activates the vagus nerve, which calms us down. So if you're in a moment of intense distress or a panic attack or a trauma response where your body has decided, I'm in danger. Even if your brain is like, oh, this is so annoying. I know that I'm fine, but my body is having this really intense response. That's when an ice pack to the face can be really good. Also, short bursts of intense exercise, anything to get your heart rate up. And kind of the idea behind that is that when your body is telling you that it's time to go into a fight or flight response, if you get your heart rate up, your body thinks that you successfully either fought a predator or fled from a predator. So you're communicating to your brain, I'm good. Like, I expended all this energy. I'm safe now, right? And then slow paced breathing is another one. And for that, you want to breathe out for longer than you breathe in. So like in for 3, out for 6, in for 4, out for 8. And that also triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of your nervous system that calms you down. So breathing, ice to the face, exercise are 3 of the best tools to use in the moment if you're having a panic attack or a flashback or any kind of a trauma response.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. You mentioned fight or flight, but what about freeze or fawn? Do those do the
Yes.
same, does that have the same impact to the brain, or are those a different category?
Yes, so those 4, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, those are called the threat responses. And those are modulated by our reptilian brain, which is back here in like kind of above our neck. And so those are unconscious responses that our body goes into when we experience a threat. And it's really important to remember that those responses are outside of our conscious control. So we may experience a scary situation and we may completely freeze and not know what to do. And then afterwards, it's very common for people who've been through a trauma to kind of like beat themselves up and say, God, I can't believe I froze in that situation. I should have fought back, or I should have stood up for myself or whatever, and experience a lot of guilt over those, how they responded, like which threat response came up. And so it's really important to remember, like, those are totally unconscious and they're not optional, right? They're what our body does to try to keep us as safe as possible. So fight is like fighting off, a predator or an attacker. Flight is running away as fast as we can. Freeze is literally just freezing and becoming immobile. And fawn is actually becoming kind of docile and compliant and being like as nice and sweet as possible. And, in certain situations, that's your best chance of survival.
Yeah. So, we'll move to the audience in just a few minutes. But my final question is really around physiologically, what happens once we've healed the trauma? Like, what actually changes in our brain, in our body, that would, show that we've healed from it, and that would correlate with a future, stimulus not leading to that
Yeah.
flood of fear.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So what we would probably be expecting to see would be new neural pathways and less activity around the amygdala and the emotional part of the brain, the limbic brain, and more balance around the cognitive part of the brain. So one thing that's going on when we experience a trauma response is there's this part of the brain called the amygdala that is about the size of an almond, and there's one in each brain hemisphere. And the amygdala's entire job is to detect danger, right? So, like I said, if I was attacked by a bear, then anytime anything reminded me of a bear, my amygdala would sound the alarm and say, "You're in danger," right? The problem with when we develop PTSD or traumatic stress is that the amygdala is so cautious and it becomes a little bit overactive. So we're constantly detecting threat where there is no threat. And that can be super exhausting and super just like depleting in general. So what we would expect to see when somebody is healed is that their amygdala has really calmed down. It's a lot less active. Their nervous system is more balanced. And, in people who have what we would call complex trauma, which would be like a lot of trauma over a long period of time, we can see on brain scans that the limbic center of the brain, so the emotional center of the brain, is actually bigger and more active than it should be. And the cognitive part of the brain is actually smaller and less active than it should be. So when we heal from trauma, we can see a little bit of a balancing out of this effect. And one thing I didn't mention is that meditation is really, really powerful for increasing energy and neural activity in our cognitive part of our brain, that can balance out our emotional part of the brain, right? So in a person who doesn't have trauma, something scary happens and there's activity in the emotional part of the brain. And then the cognitive part of the brain comes online and says, that's a little scary, but it's actually not a threat to your life and you're going to be able to get through it and we're good. So there's this kind of balance between the two areas. Whereas with someone with traumatic stress or PTSD, this emotional part of the brain is like really overactive and the rational part of the brain is a little bit less active. So any form of meditation, I think there is even research that says meditating as little as 5 minutes a day can be shown to increase brain activity and gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, the cognitive part of the brain. And that can have a measurable effect on emotion regulation.
Wow, incredible knowledge being transferred right now. So thank you so much for these
Oh
amazing
my
answers.
gosh, thank you.
We're gonna move to the Q&A. And feel free to add your question if you haven't already. Um, we may have covered this briefly, but maybe we just take a slightly deeper dive around the why. So Greg asks, why do you think psilocybin and other plant medicines are so effective in helping with trauma, if you think that?
Yeah, no, I do think that. And this question is a little multidimensional, right? Because from a purely scientific kind of Western medicine perspective, I think it's what we talked about with the neural growth, right? So I had a friend who actually worked in this industry described to me as, if you have a ski resort and you have ski slopes and like routes that are all skied on, and the skis have carved a deep path in the snow, that's like the trauma response in the brain. And it's hard once you're used to skiing this way to forge a new path skiing this way when you have to go through like the forest and the snow and all that, right? So when you do the plant medicine or the ketamine, it's like adding 10 feet of fresh snow to the whole ski resort. And then from there, you can just choose your path. You're not tempted to go down these deeply ingrained paths, right? So that's one metaphor for why we think that plant medicine is so effective neurologically. Now, from a spiritual perspective, there's a whole nother conversation to be had, right? That isn't necessarily backed up by Western medicine. But, I don't necessarily think Western medicine is the end all be all of everything. I think that a lot of communities have seen the huge effects of plant medicine for, thousands of years. And in the Western world, we're just kind of catching on to that, So there's a spiritual component, there's a heart opening component that can be extremely powerful as well.
Yeah, thank you for the balance between the West and the East or the South. We have another question around sort of pre-cognitive trauma when we're 0 or 1 or 2. I guess kind of the question is around, do we experience trauma such as neglect from our parents when we're in that age group? Would that be considered a trauma that could lead to future stress?
Absolutely. So we can start to experience trauma even as early as being in the womb, right? They've had research that shows if there is a pregnant person who is being physically assaulted or experiencing violence during the pregnancy, that actually impacts the brain development of the developing fetus. So trauma can start at any point, definitely pre-verbal. And when it happens in a pre-verbal state, all that kind of happens is that it's kind of coded in the brain in less of a verbal way. So it might present as more of an emotional response rather than a thought response, right? So it might not, somebody might come to therapy and they might say, when I experience this rejection, I just feel a really intense pit in my stomach. And it's not like a thought like, oh, I'm worthless, right? That would be a cognitive response. It's more of a somatic, like body focused response. The good news is it doesn't matter if it's encoded pre-verbally or verbally, we can still heal it with the trauma modalities. So that's the good news.
But if let's take EMDR for example, can you really unpack that memory in the free association to actually heal it? Or is EMDR not good for trauma, that you don't have that, encoded
Yeah,
memory?
no, it's a good question. So absolutely, EMDR can be super effective for healing trauma that we don't have a conscious memory of, right? So what we might do is start with what is the, like, let's say somebody was, neglected by their caregiver from ages 0 to 2, and they've internalized a lot of sensitivity around rejection. And then that's showing up in their dating life or in their social life. What we would do with EMDR is we wouldn't necessarily need to go back to remember when you were 1 year old and your mom was neglecting you, because they don't have a memory of that. What we would do is we would start with, okay, when you text this person and they don't text you back, let's start there and let's look at the response that happens there, and that's the entry point.
Got it. So Carol asked about our dreams, how our dreams could somehow be used to cure trauma or address trauma. Do you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on the relationship between our dreams and how we might be able to use them to heal?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So one of the main symptoms of PTSD and traumatic stress overall is nightmares, right? Having distressing dreams about a situation. There's a lot of, in the field of psychoanalysis, the idea of exploring our dreams and finding meaning in our dreams. So that can certainly be, I think, totally relevant and useful. Um, Now, if dreams are serving as a trauma cue, I think I'm hearing that as somebody has a nightmare and that triggers a trauma response. So that's where we would have them wake up from the nightmare and then do any kind of self-soothing or nervous system regulation tools that they can do. Ice pack to the face, deep breathing, snuggling with a pet, calling a loved one or a friend, listening to soothing music or watching a soothing show, like anything that they can do to regulate their nervous system after the nightmare. And then DBT actually has a really interesting nightmare protocol that I love, and it's good for recurring dreams. And the idea is if you have a recurring nightmare, you write out the plot of the nightmare, you write it out like a story. And then when it gets to the scary or the disturbing part, you rewrite the story so that it's not scary. So you say, right when the bad guy's going to kill me, you know, Superman comes in and saves me and rescues me and kills the bad guy, and then I'm safe and he takes me to heaven, and then I'm chilling out with the spirits, or whatever you want to narrate the dream to be. So you write out an alternative narrative and then you rehearse that before bed. So you're kind of training your brain, and then that is supposed to help you have a different dream instead of repeating the nightmare. Because the idea is there's something about recurring nightmares that are just habitual, right? It's just the same neurons firing in the same patterns. And so if we challenge that and change the narrative, it can change the nightmare. So that's kind of a cool approach as well.
Beautiful. The dreams, that's a whole unexplored territory for many of us. We're waiting
Yes.
for a clarification from Greg on his question, so we'll keep going in the meantime. This one is around managing and regulating our stress. So Bruce, writes, what is the best way to manage and regulate cortisol levels? Do you have
Yeah.
thoughts there?
Yeah, so one thing I didn't mention, and I know this, everybody has their own opinion, but when it comes to trauma, ketamine, psychedelics can be very helpful, but then the whole other thing is traditional psychiatric medication can also be very helpful, like an antidepressant, an anti-anxiety medication, and that can be really helpful for people with prolonged trauma, complex trauma, where we see in those types of experiences that the limbic brain, the emotional part of the brain, is actually larger than it should be, and it's overactive, and that can contribute to higher levels of cortisol and adrenaline and all kinds of brain chemicals that make us feel stressed out. So there's plenty of people who don't want to pursue traditional psychiatric medication, and that's okay too. But psych medication can be a very effective way to manage our stress levels. And then aside from medication, it's like meditation, exercise, getting enough sleep, just all of the basic kind of health and wellness things. And then developing a tool set of things we can do to self-soothe. So if you have a pet, pets are really, really great for self-soothing because they release that oxytocin in the brain that calms us down. Talking to a loved one or talking to a friend, hanging out with a friend, exercise, playing games, watching TV, listening to music. So the idea is that if you've had trauma and you have higher stress levels as a result, you want to have kind of in your repertoire, like all kinds of things that help regulate you in the moment. And then in those high levels of distress, like we talked about, ice pack to the face, deep breathing. There's a great device called Calmigo that helps measure the length of your breath. I have found when I'm in distress, it's really hard for me to make my out breath longer than my in breath, which is the type of breath we need to do to regulate. So I have a Calmigo device. It's like a little thing that you breathe into. It's like $200, and then it lights up when it's time for your out breath to stop. So it times it for you. and I'll get out the Kelmigo, I'll put a timer on my phone for like 5 minutes and I'll just do the breath. And it's so helpful. It's crazy. So I recommend that to all my clients.
Beautiful. Gold. We have a lot of gold on this call. Um, so Greg clarified, what is going on psychologically and emotionally when you've done all this work to become your higher self, but then you're in a family setting and you just get triggered and end up going back to this like less evolved childlike version of yourself who has tantrums. I'm assuming that's what you mean, Greg. What's happening there?
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, I don't know that I could just say definitively, like, this is exactly what's happening, right? But I think that it has to do with patterns, and this actually has to do, I think, with family systems, right? And in a family dynamic, how we kind of fall into different roles and then pull different things from each other. So it is kind of a universally recognized experience that you can do all this amazing work on yourself and you can heal in all these ways. And then you go home for Thanksgiving and you revert right back to like that petulant 12-year-old who like hates their parents or whatever, you know? And on some level, it has to do with you're being triggered by your parents, right? Or your aunt or uncle or your siblings. And your brain is saying, this is familiar to me. And this is how I respond to this trigger based on my 18 years of growing up in this house, right? So it's the brain works on pattern recognition. So you go to that setting and your brain is like, oh, this is familiar. And this is the familiar response, right? And it can take a lot of energy to override those deeply learned, deeply ingrained responses. So I say, have a lot of grace, have a lot of compassion. If you come from a really challenging family system, maybe try to limit the amount of time you spend, like maybe stay at a hotel instead of staying at their house. If you can, I know that's not always possible, or take breaks, right? Like spend 4 hours cooking on Thanksgiving and then take a half hour to connect with a supportive friend and kind of debrief and refresh and then come back and finish the celebration,
Okay, well, Thanksgiving is coming up, so let's all prepare for the hotel rooms. Um, Ginger asks, are there potential negatives to trying to process traumatic memories alone? And what would you recommend for people looking to get into education or certification around trauma therapy?
These are such good questions. I'm so glad to hear these. So absolutely, when it comes to processing traumatic memories, it's kind of like going into the belly of the beast. So it can be very, very activating and very overwhelming. When it comes to EMDR and Brainspotting, I believe they only train licensed mental health professionals to do those modalities. So you have to have a state issued license. You can't be like a coach or some other kind of whatever. Not to say there's anything wrong with coaches, just whatever. That's the current thing, is that you have to be licensed. When it comes to somatic experiencing, and I believe sensory motor, you can get training and certification in those without having to like be a licensed therapist. So they're more accessible, which I think is really great. I think the reason for EMDR and Brainspotting being relegated to licensed people is that it can bring up so much that can be so challenging. They want you to like have some idea like how to handle it. Not to say that other people wouldn't, but that's just our current system for licensing. When it comes to EMDR, there's a lot of assessment as a therapist that we do to say, is this person even stable enough to do EMDR, right? So if the person is suicidal, or they're engaging in self-harm, or they're engaging in drug abuse or disordered eating, those are red flags, and we don't do EMDR when those issues are active. We want to help the person stabilize and get really safe and grounded before we bring in the EMDR, because when we bring in the EMDR, we're basically turning the volume up on pain, right? And we need proof that this person can sit with pain and not self-destruct in the face of pain. So there is a lot of there are a lot of safety precautions that we need to take. And then, yeah, processing these traumatic memories alone, I don't know that it's necessarily effective. I mean, you can certainly try. I think, journaling can be a good one. One of the things that I think is really interesting about healing trauma is that as a species, we are a social species, and a lot of trauma has happened in relationship. So I think the healing is best to do in relationship as well. So I think even if you could do EMDR on yourself, which I don't really think you can, it's better to do it with another person, because it's adding that relational component of establishing safety and being seen and being held by another person.
Wow, fascinating. It'll be interesting to see once there's AI therapists, if that can also help scale that type of treatment to those who
That is
can't
such a
afford.
good point. Yeah, that's crazy. I never even thought of that, but yeah, that would be really interesting.
Bruce also asked for your opinion on IFS, internal family
Yes.
systems,
Oh
and
my gosh. Thank you, Bruce. I totally should have mentioned IFS. So internal family systems, phenomenal for unpacking trauma, processing trauma. I'm embarrassed that I forgot it. So thank you for calling it to my attention. Internal family systems has to do with identifying different parts of the psyche and what role each part is playing, and just kind of unpacking in that field. And again, it's another modality I'm not trained in, so it's not my area of expertise, but I know enough about it to know it's a really, really powerful modality, and I've worked with people who are trained in it. I've actually been trying to get trained in IFS, and it's like you can't. It's like all the trainings are full. There's like a year-long or 2-year-long waiting list. But in terms of the question of getting certified in trauma therapy, I believe there is some IFS that you can get certified in, whether you're a therapist or not. So I think there's like IFS for therapists, and then there's IFS coaching. So that's a good one to look into. If you're a licensed therapist, EMDR, Brainspotting, somatic experiencing, sensory motor, all of these are phenomenal modalities, IFS. If you're not a licensed therapist, I think you can read and learn as much as you can. And I think you can do some somatic and some IFS coaching as well.
beautiful. So first, thank you so much for this incredible